Chapter 7, the Protists. In this unit, we'll be studying eukaryotic cells, including those in the protist kingdom, and then also the fungi kingdom, and then a few in the animal kingdom, the helminths. Chapter 7 focuses on the protists. And so a little bit about the eukaryotic cell. If you remember, eukaryotic cells are larger cells than prokaryotes. They have a nucleus, and that is because the DNA needs to be contained in a membrane-bound organelle. And they have other membrane-bound organelles like Golgi apparatus and endoplasmic reticulum. They also have mitochondria, and then some organisms have chloroplasts. Those that are capable of photosynthesis have chloroplasts. So we'll talk about some of those later. As far as the origin of eukaryotes, we talked a little bit before about the history of prokaryotes and that they evolved more than 3 billion years ago, and that eukaryotes evolved about 1 billion years later. And so there are some theories out there as far as how this actually happened. And the main one is the endosymbiotic theory. Symbiosis in general means living together, and we'll talk a lot about this when we study fungi. Endo means within, so one organism living within another. And so some of the major events that they think occurred is that, first of all, a prokaryote, maybe a little larger prokaryote, started to fold its plasma membrane. Anytime that it can infold, it can create these different compartments like some of the organelles that we look at. And then anytime you have more folding in a cell, that increases surface area. The more surface area there is, the more likely that more events can take place in a small area as well. And so then the second event is scientists think that maybe a larger prokaryotic cell engulfed a smaller prokaryotic cell. And these smaller prokaryotic cells were most likely bacteria. And so these little bacteria ended up working for a larger cell. And because they had these things working for them, they were able to become larger and to have more functions in the cell. So you can kind of study this diagram and look at the infolding here. When the plasma membrane folds in, remember prokaryotes have their DNA kind of just contained in what we would call a nucleoid, but the infolding led to a nucleus, different structures as well. And so if this larger cell engulfed some smaller cells, if you look and see, these look very much like mitochondria. And then also some of these organisms may have engulfed other bacterial cells that became chloroplasts. So mitochondria and chloroplasts are considered to kind of be the evidence as far as the endosymbiotic theory. Again, it's not known for sure, but just trying to kind of reconstruct what may have happened as part of the endosymbiotic theory. The reason that this endosymbiotic theory is so accepted in the scientific community is that the evidence is thought to be the mitochondria and chloroplasts. Mitochondria and chloroplasts we know now as structures found in a eukaryotic cell, but they have a lot in common with bacteria. And so if you look at the chart here, you can see that as far as average size goes, mitochondria and chloroplasts are about the same size as a bacteria would be. They don't have a nuclear envelope, so they don't have a nucleus on their own. The DNA, they actually contain their own DNA. We know that bacteria contains DNA, but mitochondria and chloroplasts contain DNA. And they can actually reproduce on their own through binary fission as well. So these are some of the characteristics that we learned about bacteria. And so when we look at mitochondria and chloroplasts, we see that, wow, they do the same things that bacteria do. They have ribosomes, and then they also make some of their own proteins. And so they're capable of these little mini factories inside of a larger cell. And so just with all of those striking resemblances to bacteria, then it's thought that maybe, again, those larger cells enveloped those smaller cells, and the smaller cells began working as the mitochondria and chloroplasts. So what's an advantage of being a eukaryotic cell? Well, a eukaryotic cell can be larger, and we've talked before about that's not always a good thing, but basically they're more complex, and so they can have more functions. They're capable of greater diversity. The more things you can do that are different, the more likely maybe of finding something that stands out can be increased. And then also they're more likely to become multicellular. And so a lot of cells can work together rather than just one single cell mostly working on its own as well. And so when you look at this diagram here, you can kind of see the bacteria and archaea, it's kind of an evolutionary diagram. But looking at some of the multicellular organisms, animals, fungi, plants, they are eukaryotes, along with some other single-celled protists that are eukaryotes as well. But we'll be studying some of these as we go. So when it comes to the protist kingdom, it's kind of they call it a microbial grab bag because there's a lot of different organisms and nothing really fits in here neatly like we might want to happen. And so right now this is a kingdom. Of the 6 kingdoms, the protist kingdom is one. 4 of those kingdoms are eukaryotic kingdoms, and then the other 2 are prokaryotic, the bacteria and archaea. But I wouldn't be surprised if in the future that this kingdom is actually broken into at least 2 kingdoms as well. And you'll kind of see why as we go along and look at the different organisms that are in this kingdom. So just some general characteristics here of protists. Most of them are unicellular. That means they exist as one single cell. Some do live in colonies, which means that several cells live together, but they are independent. And so something like humans are multicellular. We have more than one cell that works together. Most of them are pretty small, but some can actually be as large as 1 millimeter. And I have a ruler here to show you what 1 millimeter is. And in this case, this is about 1 centimeter. It's a little more blown up than actual size. But one little tick here on a ruler that shows centimeters would be 1 millimeter. So that's something that you could see with your eye, but it's still going to be pretty small. Other things that we look at, we wouldn't be able to see unless we use a microscope. We wouldn't be able to see them very well. As far as protists go, again, it's kind of a mixed bag here. They're all different ways of getting nutrition. Some are heterotrophs, which means that they have to either take in their food or absorb their food across the membrane, but they have to physically get the food into their cells. Something like an autotroph is able to make their own food, and then the food that they make they can actually use. And then sometimes we have mixotrophs that actually do a little bit of both. And so it's just a way of classifying how do they get their nutrients. We are heterotrophs because we have to eat our food, and so that's what makes them us heterotrophs. Autotrophs, something like a plant that can, through photosynthesis, produce its own food, would be an example there. Most of the protists reproduce by asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction is simpler. A lot of times it can happen different ways, but one of the ways is by binary fission, where the cell just doubles and then splits into 2. And so it can be kind of a simple process when it comes to as far as what is passed on. In asexual reproduction, the DNA is going to be exactly alike. From parent to offspring, the DNA is going to be the same, unless there's a mutation in the DNA. But as far as passing on chromosomes, those chromosomes are going to be identical. A lot of these organisms, though, also are capable of sexual reproduction, which means that there is a gamete that is formed. A gamete is going to contain half of the original chromosomes so that it can meet up with another gamete, kind of an opposite type, kind of like a male and female egg and sperm, but not always in the case of protists, or not in the case of protists. But sexual reproduction just means that those 2 gametes come together, and in that way the chromosomes are a little more diverse than if it were asexual reproduction. We'll talk about that again too. Most protists live in the water and the soil. Again, if they're single cell, they probably need a good amount of moisture in order to survive as well. And then some of them find a host, and they live in a host. And sometimes they can live in a host without causing that host any problems. If they do cause a host problems, then they are pathogenic, which means they cause disease. So there are a lot of ways to classify protists. Even some textbooks will, if we call something a protozoan, it'll say that it's an algae. It's all in the protist kingdom at this point, but sometimes it's very unclear. So just because you see it a certain way, maybe in this textbook, doesn't mean it'll always be that way in another textbook as well. But we try to do the best we can as far as how we put them into these groups. So you can focus on our textbook. So first of all, in the protist kingdom, there are the protozoans. And so these are put into a group because they're a little more animal-like. They're not animals. They're not the animal kingdom. They're not multicellular. They're single-celled. But protozoa means very first. And then zoa, proto means very first, and zoo means animal. These are heterotrophs, so they have to actually ingest their food. They have to find their food, and then they have to ingest their food or absorb it across their cell wall. They have to get it into their cell. I'm sorry, not their cell wall, their cell membrane, because they do not have cell walls. These organisms are also usually motile in some form. Motile means they can either get around on their own. Sometimes they have to get around by passing from one host to another as well. And then a lot of times these organisms can form cysts. A trophozoite is kind of the regular cell, and it's in its most vegetative form. It's sort of its normal form during ideal conditions. But if nutrients are scarce, or there's stressful conditions, then they can form a cyst. A cyst is kind of like going into hibernation. They can get back to their trophozoite stage, but the cyst allows them to still survive when nutrients are scarce. These organisms are part of the food chain a lot of times, and they're little, tiny single cells, but they're very important because they do a lot of recycling of the nutrients in the ecosystem, and so that other organisms can use those nutrients. And then also decomposers, so breaking down dead matter, and then that's part of the recycling process as well. A lot of species that we look at we'll call plankton, and we'll talk about that in a little bit here. But there's zooplankton versus more of the animal-like, and phytoplankton. Those are organisms that would use photosynthesis. So as far as classification goes, there's kind of 4 groups that we're going to look at. And one is the pseudopods, those that have pseudopods, those that have flagella, those that have cilia, and those that are non-motile. It says non-motile, which means they can't get around on their own, but they do pretty well when they find a host. And we'll see a great example of that with malaria. So those with pseudopods, first of all, these are mostly a lot of times amoebas. And so a picture of an amoeba is here. A pseudopod is really just an extension of the cell. And the pseudopods can change shape. The terminology really means false foot. But if you look at a cell, remember a eukaryotic cell, this would be its membrane that we're looking at, kind of surrounding the outside. And so as it shifts and changes the inside, the cytoskeleton and the cytoplasm can change, and so it'll stick out these protrusions from the cell. But this will change as it moves and flows. And so it actually allows the cell to get around. It allows the cell to find food. It allows the cell sometimes to capture prey. So it can take these pseudopods, and if there's prey here, my little red dot is prey, then it can surround it and take it into the cell and digest it into the cell. Not all of them cause diseases, but there are some that certainly stand out, one of which is called Entamoeba histolytica, and this causes amoebic dysentery. Dysentery is usually kind of bloody diarrhea, can also cause ulcers and pain. And then there's another one called the acanthamoeba, and a lot of times these organisms will get into the eye. They can get to the eye from just swimming in water that has these, even showering with tap water, and then putting a contact in and maybe trapping something behind that contact can be kind of dangerous. So using saline solution carefully with contacts is always a good idea. And there is a recommendation out there that you shouldn't shower with your contacts in, but if you're a little bit blind like me, that's probably not a good idea. But these can cause some pretty nasty disease of the eye, and a lot of times people will lose vision in their eye because of them. The next group are the foraminiferans, and these are kind of an odd group. They do have pseudopods. The pseudopods do move in and out of these pores, but they actually have these kind of harder, chalky cells. They're called tests. And so they really look nothing like an amoeba or anything like that. But you can look here, see there's these deposits of those that have built up on the cliffs of Dover. And so they actually think that they evolved about 225, or not evolved, but they were really present in great populations 225 million years ago. And a lot of times they're used, if you find these foraminiferans, they're often near oil sources. And so in drilling, they're looked for a lot in that case. Another group are the radiolarans. These usually live in the oceans, and these are, again, single-celled here, and they have these really special glassy skeletons made up of silicon dioxide. And so because of that, they have these really kind of cool-looking designs here, and they really stand out. These also build up in the sediment, and so they can be found, and a lot of times when they're found, they're really, really old, and the deposits of them can be found as well.